Welcome to another broadcast from mindyourhealthcast.com. I know you've been sitting on the edge of your chair anxiously awaiting the last of the series, maybe not because you're interested in what I'm saying, but hoping I get it over with and get on to something else. But in any case, this is the concluding chapter of 3 broadcasts regarding the effect in my thinking and my view of the world that came about as a result of discovering, I didn't discover it actually, but I discovered about it, quantum physics and the whole concept of how it affects everything in the world. I guess one of my very first books I mentioned before, and I'm hoping that you might get at least a few of the basic books and start your education. Quantum physics is not something that you'll sit down and do a reading and say, oh yeah, I understand what it's all about. It takes a bit of transformation in your thinking and mental processes to really bring it into perspective to the point that it's something more than a curiosity. It's very easy to say, wow, and as I mentioned, the term quantum has taken on an honorific meaning in the sense that people apply it to almost anything, and because the term quantum is there, people think, wow, that must be great, it must be powerful, it must really do something, and of course it could be nothing, but just attaching the word quantum adds a certain mystique to the product or to the process or whatever it is you're doing that you apply the word quantum to. We want you to learn enough about it so when you look at something that says it's quantum, like quantum healing, there's a book out called Quantum Healing, there's a book, books related to quantum society, quantum consciousness, and all kinds of things that relate to the quantum. And so if you understand enough about it, you can begin to think, well, now, is that really making an application of the principles of quantum physics, or is that a sales gimmick to make it sound very mysterious and in some way deeply powerful and potent beyond the normal? So that was one of the things I found out early. Now, I had mentioned that you really would do well to watch a movie called What the Bleep Do We Know, and or its sequel. It was edited and added to later. Either version's good, but the second version was called What the Bleep Down the Rabbit Hole, which of course is from Alice in Wonderland idea that everything is different there. And anyhow, it gives you some options as to how far down the rabbit hole you want to go. In other words, you want just a touch of it, or do you want to jump in with both feet and really get heavy into the ideas? Some of the authors that I have mentioned, like Fred Alan Wolf, who's a quantum physicist, and William Tiller, some of these guys, and several people that have to do with the brain and brain function, mind function, healing, several of these are also in the little vignettes they bring in as different things are happening. Now remember I said that the movie is kind of a short episode out of the life of a lady, and as different things happen to her, they put her aside for a few moments and they bring on some scientist, doctor, physicist, whatever, to talk a little bit about the principle of what's going on. And so it's a good movie to kind of start tweaking your mind and expanding it. Now sometimes you might feel the sutures in your cranium stretching just a bit. So don't be surprised at that. It's a good exercise in thinking And ultimately, whether you agree with it or not, or whether you still are in love with the Newtonian idea that the universe and everything is like a clock, and once you have the formula for it, you can calculate the past, the future, and everything just follows like clockwork, as you've probably heard the expression before. And it's very predictable, very comfortable, and here comes this quantum concept that the mathematics aren't even precise in the sense that clockwork mathematics are. They are probabilistic mathematics. That means that you're talking about the likelihood of something happening. So the greater the likelihood that would happen, the greater the probability that it would happen. And what quantum physics says is that at a certain point of influence, that a quantum wave of probability can collapse and become unobservable reality as we think of it. And that's very unsettling to people because, as I think I've mentioned to you already, if I haven't, that what it ultimately got to, and again, you need to go back and watch the first two because I can't recap everything, or it's going to take another broadcast to recap what I talked about before. But the fact is that what they found is that as it relates to electrons really don't exist circling around the nucleus of an atom as we were always taught. When I was young, when they talked about atoms, they said it's like a miniature solar system. You know, the nucleus is like the sun, and the electrons are like planets revolving around this sun. And so it's very easy to understand. Nature's very consistent. Nature works like clockwork, and that's all there is. But then, when they really got into it, I mentioned one of the first things that threw a wrench in the gears of classical physics. One was the black body radiation paradox, and the other was the photoelectric effect that Einstein received the Nobel Prize for writing a paper on. And giving an explanation. Of course, he didn't just write a paper, but he gave an explanation as to what was going on. And so, if you look at that, his explanation ultimately was that, well, let's go back one step. You know, and again, in the clockwork universe, we had basically matter or particles, and we had waves that were non-materialistic. That means they had no matter associated. They were just energy waves of a sort, and they had mathematics for waves and they had mathematics for particles, in a sense. Well, anyhow, once he wrote his paper and explained the photoelectric effect, that when a beam of light hits a metal plate and dislodges electrons, there has to be something solid involved. And the solidity, he said, well, everybody up until that point knew that it was an electromagnetic wave and hence had no material matter, and therefore it theoretically could not knock electrons out of orbit, but it was doing it. So how did it do it? So that was a paradox. So what he said was, well, you know that light is a wave, but under certain conditions, light can behave like a particle. And when it behaves like a particle, he called it a photon. And therefore it can then collide with electrons and knock them out of orbit from the plate of metal. And so that was his explanation. Well, right away some other physicists and mathematicians jumped on that, and they said, well, it appears that it's true that light being a wave and actually generally conforming to electromagnetic mathematics of waves, then it can be a particle under these certain conditions. Well, maybe particles, i.e. electrons, maybe they can behave like particles or waves also. And so the mathematics worked out that yes, it could go either way. So what that said then, that electrons, when they are in these orbitals around a nucleus, aren't really particles, but they're waves of probability. And so that's the big, getting back to the probability mathematics. So it was known from chemistry and so forth that in the first orbital around the nucleus, only 2 electrons can exist in that orbital. Okay, so that sounds simple enough. And so if you look, you will find 2 electrons if the particular substance has 2, like helium has 2 protons and hence 2 electrons. So that makes that outer shell complete. And so helium is not very reactive, you know, because if you take hydrogen, which is 1 proton, 1 electron, it's a very explosive gas. Add 1 proton and 1 electron more, and it becomes helium, which won't burn. It'll put out, actually, a fire. It will stop combustion. So, without getting into too much heavy stuff, the amount of available electron space in the outer ring determines the activity of a substance. So when you have a full outer ring of electrons, the substance is considered to be inert, and therefore it doesn't do things. It doesn't combine with other elements. Now, there is, I guess, a way of forcing that, but in some certain limited cases, but we won't even bother with that. I'm only saying this to say that then, according to quantum physics, electrons behave like particles or waves, depending. When they're supposedly in orbit, they are so many that are allowed in each of the rings or orbits. And however, when you're not looking, they're just waves of probability. They're bumps in a wave around the nucleus. So when you decide to look, like in the first orbital, there's supposedly only can be 2 electrons. So that means there's 2 waves of probability in existence. Okay, so now if you want to look and find something, you apply mathematics that have to do with probabilistics. Meaning, okay, it could be here, it could be here, but we won't know till we look. But what we do know is, if we do look, that we will collapse the wave function and find an electron 50% of the time in one spot and 50% of the time in the other spot, if you average out the observations. And it's the idea of looking that collapses that wave of probability. Now, if you think of electromagnetics, where you have these sine waves, the more amplitude of the wave, the more energy there is, or more voltage if you're working with electricity, therefore more powerful in the sense that it has more energy in that wave at that point. So when you build a wave higher and higher, at a certain point you can collapse the wave into what appears to be matter. So if you look then for these electrons, as I say, you look several times, and half of the time you would find an electron in one spot, and you would half the time find it in the other spot, etc. Okay, I don't want to confuse you too much, but what happened is some of the physicists said, no, electrons are particles. There's something strange about this light thing, but electrons are particles, they're solid. But anyhow, lo and behold, somebody said, hey, let's set up an experiment, we'll find out if this is really true. And so they did. They eventually set up what was called the 2-slit experiment. Now, some of you have probably read this, and you're going to think, oh, this is redundant. Kind of boring to hear that again. But the interesting thing about it was, this was to prove that electrons have this dual behavior. And so they set up this experiment with a film, which was a target. In front of the film, they put a shield. And then in front of the shield, they put an electron gun that could fire electrons. Okay, they set it up so it could fire 1 electron at a time. Okay, and so they opened 1 slit in the shield, And every time they fired an electron, they would go through that slot and they would hit the film and make little dots on the film, little black dots, which indicated a particle collision with the film. Okay, so well, yeah, that means the electron is acting like a particle. But then they said, well, what would happen if we open two slots? And we still fire one electron at a time, and it goes through one or the other slots. Well, that's not what happened. What happened was, it appeared to go through both slots at the same time, but not as a particle, but as a wave. So on the other side of the shield, on the film, we had an interference pattern formed. Now, I don't know if you are acquainted with an interference pattern, but waves, when they interact with each other, create nodal points of a sort, and it's called an interference pattern. So it forms like a series of dark areas that are created by waves. Now, if I'm sure you've done it or seen it done. If you go down to a little smooth stream or pond and you throw a rock in, when the rock hits, it sets off a concentric rings of waves that travel outward. Now, if you throw a second rock in right after that, near that, as the waves intersect, they make peaks where they intersect. And those peaks are an interference pattern of the two waves crossing each other. And so, lo and behold, here, just because you changed the experiment, all of a sudden, now electrons are no longer going through one or the other slot as a particle. It's going through both slots at the same time, forming a wave pattern. Now, see, that was one of the early experiments that demonstrated that, well, you know, it's awfully strange. We don't understand why, but I guess it's true. And so they did the same thing with the interconnectedness or entanglement, which was another aspect of quantum physics. They found out that, or they hypothesized to begin with, let's put it that way, that anytime two particles or photons are in vicinity relationship with each other and they separate, no matter how far they separate, if you do anything to the one electron, it immediately affects the other. Or if you do it to a photon, it's going to affect the other. In other words, but the thing about it, it's instantaneous. Without going into all the technicalities again, Einstein and two of his friends, Einstein, Rosen, Podolsky, called the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen paradox. He said that can't happen, you know, because if it did, it would violate the speed limit of the universe, which is the speed of light. Because for any two particles or photons to communicate with each other at any distance instantaneously means that they're traveling faster than the speed of light. And he said that can't be, and he called it a paradox. Well, they set up experiments, and they've now demonstrated, of course, that that does happen. You have one rotating one way and the other rotating the other way. You set them apart. If you affect the rotation of this one, the other one immediately is affected at the same time instantly, as well as the same amount. If this one goes a certain level, then this goes a certain level the other way. So they interact. And that's kind of what's called entanglement. Now, we're not going to have time to get too much into the mind aspects, which I did want to introduce to you, of quantum physics, but it does make a difference what your mind does and how it behaves. Now, if you want to get into the quantum physics side of memory and mind function, two of the best, well, three, physicists and scientists, I would say, has a lot of good material. Now, I told you that Fred Alan Wolf had the book called Star Wave, which is about the quantum physics idea and consciousness, and or mind, whatever you want to call it. And that's a good one to read, but his was kind of difficult. But what is good, you can go online and you can look up Stuart Hameroff, Hammeroff, and or Roger Penrose, who's the physicist from Cambridge who was the mentor for his PhD in physics of Stephen Hawking. The two of them have been good friends over the years, but Penrose has gotten heavily into the whole idea of quantum concepts and memory and microtubules and neurons and cells and how they could store information. And Stuart Hameroff has also. Now on his site, he's out of Arizona, on his site, Stuart Hameroff, you can actually download some of the papers that he's written on that. And some of the material that's published, they have written together. There's a book on basically the universe, the cosmos, and quantum physics and consciousness. And I'm saying this because they really all interconnect. You can't separate them. And I'm just thinking what I want to tell you next. There's a psychologist that I've known. I met him years ago in New York. He's out of California. Did a lot of research for the Porter Langley Neuropsychiatric Center. And his name is Robert Ornstein, and he's written some very good books. The first book of his I ever read was called The Psychology of Consciousness, which had to do with left brain, right brain function. Some of the early stuff that was coming out of the research that he was doing. Since then, he's written a huge number of books. But one in particular I thought was very interesting is called Mind Real, R-E-A-L. And it's how the mind creates its own virtual reality. Now I'm saying that because it in essence kind of ties in with the quantum concepts. So it might be a good book of his you would want to read, but once you get in, several of his books you might want to read. Well, I know one called The Amazing Brain is extremely good. Psychology of Conscience and Nature of Human Consciousness, which is a huge edited volume he did. And there's just a lot. There's one on time, a lot about different aspects of the brain. I think one of the really good ones is one called The Deep Self that shows how people come in different and why those differences make a difference in how they perceive the world, and also how they are affected by the world, and also the kind of problems they can develop because of those differences. Anyhow, you might find those interesting, but Robert Ornstein's book is really good. This is another book I wanted to throw it in. It's called The Quantum World, Quantum Physics for Everyone. As you get into this more, the double slot experiment that we talked about, or double slit experiment, and a lot of the things about quantum and the lumpiness of it, meaning these waves that some can collapse into a reality when you look at it. They have a lot of illustrations and so forth, and it's not a bad little book called The Quantum World, and the author is Kenneth W. Ford. So if you want to pursue it further and kind of understand it after you originally read Wolf's Taking the Quantum Leap, this is not a bad one to have some real good illustrations. Now, I wanted to move this into the mind side of it, and boy, there's just so much there. One of the things is that, there's a lot of controversy about the effects of the mind and connection of the mind. As most of you probably know, or maybe you don't, the military and CIA and so forth have, over the years, done a lot of research and application of something they call remote viewing. That's where a person is given a set of coordinates. They have no idea where they are in the world, or even what the coordinates mean, but they're connected to a target. And that person can get into a certain state, which I would call somewhere between an alpha and a theta state. And they can then get impressions about this target that they've never been there, never seen it, and draw out pictures or write out text about it or whatever. And when they check it out, of course, it's pretty accurate. And so they were interested in it for spying and so forth. And there's a lot of books out about remote viewing, and the material is pretty good, and it's a good way of training your mind to expand if you want to expand your mind. But anyhow, it even involved getting into other people's minds. But I'm introducing that to say that it goes beyond that, because there's a physicist out of Great Britain. His name is Dean Radin, R-E-D-I-N, or R-A-T-I-N, Radin. Dean Radin. Anyhow, he wrote a book about mind entanglement, that we're talking about when two particles come close to each other and when they separate, there's an entanglement. Well, they're talking about the same thing with the mind, this entanglement. And that's how people can connect. That's how a mother suddenly gets this terrible feeling and impression that something's wrong, and finds out at the time she got the feeling their child was involved in an accident or maybe something worse. But they know it immediately. And other types of things where we seem to be connected, well, Radin has a whole book that, yeah, we are connected, and it's the quantum entanglement, because the mind works according to the principles of quantum physics. So there's so much out there. I just went on the internet and did some searching under quantum physics and mind or whatever, and you can print out a huge amount of material, either just about quantum physics in general, or about actually the mind side of it, or the health side of it, because it has application to the physical body, and is probably a major explanation of placebo and nocebo effect, is that if you get in your mind that you are sick, your physical body can get sick. It has an influence. It changes you from a health state to a disease state or an illness state by focusing on it. And I've seen that in action with people. You can grow tumors with your mind, or you can get rid of tumors with your mind. And there's been some examples which I've mentioned before, where what the person thought and put their emotion into became very powerful and created that effect. So it's nocebo, meaning you can make yourself sick, or placebo, you can improve yourself by your mind state. And so people who get into a healthy state of mind become healthier people, and people who get into a sick state of mind become sicker people. So I'm saying this, man, my big interest is that all this has application to everyday life. It's just not an interesting kind of mystical concept, but it has application. You could change the state. Now, when you look at Fred Alan Wolf's book called The Body Quantum, he shows how you can change the DNA by changing the bonding, the hydrogen bonds, which work according to quantum factors, and take a good gene and convert it to a defective gene, or vice versa. Bruce Lipton, in a lot of his book, The Biology of Belief, I'm just trying to think of, there's a book called The Body Quantum. No, that's it. That's Fred Allen's. I'm sorry. Have to think a minute what his name is. But anyhow, it's quantum physics and your health or body. So there's a lot of them out there. And all you need to do is to get on Amazon and look for titles: quantum physics mind, quantum physics health, quantum physics sickness, and there'll be a lot of books come up. So it's not, there's a scarcity. But the one I mentioned before that I really want you to get into heavily is Science and Human Transformation by William Tiller. This came out of 30 years of his personal research. Extremely good book. It has information that will show you how what we get in our mind and intent actually influence or changes matter. This book is called Science and Human Transformation. Subtitle, subtle energies, intentionality, and consciousness. So it's an extremely good book. This is one of the good early books that I got. He gets into the basics, then he followed it up with a lot more research on the second book for the public. He wrote a lot of books, but these are for the public. He wrote one called Conscious Acts of Creation, how we can change things or bring things into being with our consciousness and intention. Has a lot of the physics. The second one is pretty technical, but at the same time, there's a lot you can glean out of it. The first one is more explanatory and tremendous information. I mean, again, I got interested because of health and got me going on all this stuff. You know, when I first trained in health, I mean, I'd heard the term quantum, but you know, it's not a part of your training, and they don't really get into that. But once you understand how important it is for health and illness, then you want to understand how it works, and you want to be able to recognize when you get people, because their mental state has a tremendous impact on their health. If they can develop a cancer, or they can get rid of a cancer by doing that, and it's very powerful, but subtle. Subtle meaning, you know, it's not like it's today. If you get the idea that you might get cancer, then you immediately have cancer. But it can be a subtle influence over time that can happen, or you could have it happen. I've known people personally, clinically, working over the years in the health field, that when they decided they were going to die, they died, even though physically there was no reason for it. They were able to turn their body off and die because they had decided, this is it, I'm done, I'm out of here, and they were. I've seen it happen within a day or two, I've seen it happen within a week. So this is all powerful stuff and things that you should become acquainted with, and of course it might want to make you re-examine your own self as to what your state is. And what we've done in this country, unfortunately, is that we have gotten people to think sickness. The pharmaceuticals have done a masterful job of hitting you over and over and over on the television and magazine articles, on newscasts about being sick. And you need to look out, and you need to look out for that. And all we think about is sickness. We're in a panic if we think we can't get our drugs. It's like we've created a state of illness, a national state of illness. And everybody thinks that they have to be taking some kind of medication, or they're led to believe that they can't live. And I mean, it's gotten bad. I've watched it over the years. When I was young, hardly anyone went to a doctor, and hardly anyone was very sick. Once in a while, they would get a flu or a cold, or you might get a little food poisoning if you ate some bad food. But generally, the people that I knew hardly ever went to a doctor. The doctor, we didn't have a doctor's office on every corner, and a clinic or two or three on one main road in a big city. And we're talking about major clinics. We didn't have all that stuff. We didn't have all the drugs on the market. And yet people were living, and they were living long. I mentioned before that there was a study done by a couple of gentlemen from Harvard, and they went back for 200 years and found that the average lifespan, not the average life expectancy, which is another one of those probability figures, but the average actual lifespan of people, especially in this country, was 85, the average. Some lived over 100, and some died earlier, and some, of course, were killed in accidents, which is not a part of that, because you don't factor in an unusual event like that. It has nothing to do with the capability of whether you can live long or not. But the actual fact was they could actually get birth records, death records. They established that 85 was the average, that people gradually died more and more at a slow curve, but at about 85 it started down a lot faster. That kind of was a turning point. So anyhow, here we've had medicine convince us with a probability thing, and I told you before in my early broadcasts I've mentioned that this factor they call the average life expectancy is, in my mind, pretty worthless because it's all dependent on all the variables that you throw into it. And when they first derived that years and years ago, they had men living, what, 58, 657, and women 59 or 60, because it was so close to the huge flu epidemic. Now, we haven't covered that heavily yet, but there's some quirky things about that flu epidemic. But nonetheless, a lot of people died, so that skewed the formula and made it look like we were hardly living at all. So anybody lived to 60 already were beating the odds. But that wasn't really true. What it was 85 was when things started to decline. But at any rate, they led us to believe every few years they recalculate and say, oh, well, look, now we're living longer. But what it really means is that we're farther away from the skewer, which was that big flu epidemic of 1918. So if you did nothing for people's health, if you gave them no pills or no surgery or no drugs, the number would still go up, because the farther from 1918, the less it influences the formula. And again, it's a made-up formula because it depends on what you put into it, how it comes out. And so now everybody thinks, wow, if we're going to start going downhill if we don't get some more of these drugs, and we're going to make sure we get all this treatment that's out there. And so people are pushing to make sure that they have accessibility to these very expensive drugs. And here you have the pharmaceutical interests trying to convince you that there's more and more illnesses and therefore you need more and more drugs. And of course, as you know by now, we can't afford all that. So I'm just kind of throwing that in because I am going to do a broadcast about this national sickness mode or state that we have created. So that's probably going to be my next broadcast. But I've been thinking about that for a while, and we'll give you some interesting examples about it. So at any rate, I'm hoping that I kind of tweaked you a little bit without getting too technical to get into the idea that you can create a state mentally too. And maybe everything is that, because, as I say, we don't have time to get into all the implications of what this means. But I'm saying that you can create a state where you can make things happen. And Tiller has a lot of good information in this, and the one following called Conscious Acts of Creation. And what he shows is that we even can, by intent, change the reality of a space, like a laboratory or a room or a house, with a group of people with the intent you can make a change, or you can actually imprint memory on an electronic memory chip from a human memory direct onto the chip with no wires, and that memory chip can influence other matter such as the pH of water and different things, and you could take it to another place and away from there, and it still is retaining that memory that you imprinted on. But that has to do, again, you create a quantum state that this is true, and when the quantum state is high enough, that waveform can collapse and bring it into reality. So it's interesting what all the big applications are related to the cosmos and all that. And as I say, first of all, you've got to get your mind expanded to kind of grasp some of the basic concepts. And then, as I say, there's a plethora of good stuff out. Now, there's a really good book, this is brand new, called Infinite Potential, written by Lothar, L-O-T-H-A-R, Schaffer, S-C-H-A-F-E-R. And Deepak Chopra was the other guy I was trying to think about. He wrote a foreword in this, but he wrote a book on the quantum body or quantum health also, and he's involved with some of the other books that have been written, or at least doing introductions. But anyhow, this Infinite Potential, the subtitle is What Quantum Physics Reveals About How We Should Live. It's got some very good practical things because they're trying to get you to understand where we are, how we've gotten here, and what influence we can have on it. I've been enjoying reading this. I haven't quite finished it, but there's a lot of good information, and so this is a good one. And I want to give you one more book. This one is written, this is tweaking it a little, a different direction. You know, the question is there any such thing as matter, or is there only energy that appears as matter under the right conditions? Now, there is a physicist from MIT. I think he's now retired from there. His name is Milo Wolff, M-I-L-O-W-O-L-F-F, as opposed to Fred Alan Wolff, W-O-L-F, both physicists. This professor taught at MIT for many years, and it's an investigation of the fundamental particles and their relationship to the structure of the universe, proposes an answer to the question Stephen Hawking posed it in his book, A Brief History of Time, is there a unification theory of physics? And he feels that it's the interaction of waves creating nodes or resonances that appears and behaves as matter. So you might find his stuff. He's got a couple books, because he's got another one about Schrodinger, which had a lot to do with the wave factors, the wave equations, and so forth. So he was one of the big names in early quantum physics. Okay, I think we've run out of time. I don't want to make this too long, but I hope I have given you enough information to maybe get you looking into all this and see what the applications are. Now, I just noticed a couple of printouts that I had laid out. I wanted you to find out. Well, there's just so much, but here's one that I found searched called Quantum Physics Has Confirmed It. The universe is comprised of information. Here's what it means. Quantum mechanics has answer to DNA damage, getting back to some of the things that Fred L. Wolff said. Health, healing, and quantum physics. Quantum physics, a new scientific foundation for integrative medicine. As I say, that's what kind of got my interest in it to begin with. Disease and treatment in the notions of quantum medicine, another one I printed out. Now, many of these are research articles that actually have appeared in scientific peer-reviewed journals. Now there's something brand new that just came out. This is September 2013. It was written about, called A Jewel at the Heart of Quantum Physics. And what they're saying ultimately is, at the very core of quantum physics is geometry, and that the key fundamental form is a tetrahedron, which is a three-sided pyramid of that the sides are all equal, and of course then that means the bottom is a pyramid, and so they call it a tetrahedron, and everything else is built on that. Now, there's some old scientists from way back who, Pythagoras and some of those others, said everything has to do with mathematics and geometry. And now it's looking like that as we're doing deeper and deeper delving and understanding, that maybe these people 2,000 or 3,000 years ago knew what they were talking about. And I think I mentioned a couple of books, and if I didn't, I ought to mention them again just in case. There's a couple authors, and I ran into these back along the way. Fritjof Capri wrote a book called The Tao of Physics, and Tao is spelled T-A-O. And what he showed is that if you look at quantum physics and you look at statements made by some of the more learned men and mystics and insightful people way, way back, that they were saying the same thing. They had their own terminology, but they already understood those principles. It was actually not counterintuitive, but intuitive that this is the way things work. And there was another one by Gary Zukav called The Dancing Wuli Masters, and that's W-U-L-I. And he's saying basically the same thing, that they already knew all this stuff, but they just called it something different. And so when we really look at what they were saying, we find that they already understood all this stuff. So anyhow, I think I've given you enough to kind of tweak your interest, I hope. don't think that in a few days you're going to know all about it, unless you are a super genius. You probably have to wrestle with it for a while. But once it begins to click, it's going to change your whole outlook. You're going to see the world differently, and in a much deeper, more comprehensive way. And it will help you understand a lot more about how the world works. It's not as simple as we think in some respects, and in other respects it is. But we're a part of it, and our mind, our consciousness is a part of the whole thing. And it affects us, and it affects everything around us. So I hope that you'll enjoy this adventure. And until the next broadcast, we want you to go to the website. We keep posting things on there. We keep adding books. And there's some pages of informative things, like whole body vibration, for example. There's a page on that and what that's all about. And a lot of other things that have to do with health. There's some light sound machines that can help you in terms of learning to relax your body and to improve your creativity and your memory and concentration and all kinds of things. So I've been into this all over the years, and I think once you start expanding your mind, there's just so much that is available. It's an exciting adventure. I mean, after all these years, I'm as excited, if not more so now, than I was even at the beginning. Of course, it's better when you've learned more about it and it begins to all come together and make sense. And it takes a little bit to get there, but to me, it's sure worth the journey. So until the next broadcast, be healthy.